interviews of survivors of the massacre. One of them was my great-grandmother, Rosetta Moore. My great-grandmother would share the following. This interview was taken June 22nd, 1921. On Tuesday evening, about 9:30 o'clock, I heard the report that they were going to mob a colored boy. But my family and I remained at home. Then we heard firing. I ran for my daughter. Then a man and his family came running by, and he said, "The whites have burned my home and over $7,000. His wife had on about one piece of clothing. Then a crowd came and reported that they were burning and killing, and as they went by, meaning the whites were killing and burning, I ran behind a cabin, but they were crowding us so closely that I ran out to an outhouse where I began to pray. Then the crowd of whites ordered everybody to come out of the house, but they were slow about coming out. So the ruffians shot against the house. I ran further and saw about 15 white men chasing a man who was helpless. They even fired at him, but missed. I then went upon the hill carrying a small bundle of clothes and bedding. I was lost for my daughter and her baby until late in the afternoon Wednesday. I saw about 5 women faint. At the Presbyterian church, I saw about 4 little children who were lost from their mothers. Old and young had to pile onto trucks. And when we were being driven through town, men were seen clapping their hands, rejoicing at our condition. My great-grandmother would pass away in 1925 and be buried at Oak Lawn Cemetery. Our family endeavors to find my great-grandmother and give her the due respect that she and so many others deserve. As I said, it has been an honor to serve on this committee because my reality every day of my life is if my grandparents had not survived that tragic day, I would not be standing here. And I take that very seriously. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. With that, we will begin our meeting. The purpose for tonight's meeting is the following. At our December meeting, the Physical Investigation Committee presented the results of their geophysical investigation at 3 locations: Oak Lawn Cemetery, New Block Park, the Canes, which is an area along the Arkansas River. That investigation identified a number of anomalies at both Oak Lawn and the Canes. Tonight we will hear from Carrie Stuckelbeck with the Oklahoma Archaeological Society and Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield, a forensic anthropologist with the University of Florida, on their recommendations for a feasibility study that will lay the groundwork for the second phase of our work. We will also receive an update from the Historical Context Committee on their efforts to collect and archive the oral histories we've received in the past several months and combine those with information gathered during the 2001 State Commission report. And finally, we'll receive an update on efforts to conduct a geophysical investigation at the Rolling Oak Cemetery, formerly known as the Booker T. Washington Cemetery. We'll begin with an invocation by Pastor Turner.
Let us pray. O God, our Father, we, your children, bow, thanking you for this day and this time. We pray, dear Lord, for this city. We ask, oh God, you bless this committee. We pray for the reports that are given. We ask that you help us and lead us to find where all your children are, wherever they may be, cemeteries, sidewalks, underneath overpasses, wherever they may be, rivers, streams, parks, that you bless us with your grace to find each and every one, that they be walked over, driven over, and looked over no more. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen.
We'll now have a report from the Historical Context Committee.
Thank you, Ms. Alford. I'll be filling in for Hannibal Johnson, who's the chair of that committee tonight. The Historical Context Committee's reports first begin with some of the oral histories that they received as part of this work, and so I wanted to read a couple to the crowd to begin their report. The first comes from a person who identified themselves as KR, the initials KRW. This oral history, I hope, will bring some closure to the 1921 tragedy. My uncle Arlie Williamson, while en route to Wichita, Kansas, had he and his truck commandeered by men with guns just as he started to cross a river bridge, which one he did not recount, coming into Tulsa from Wagner, hauling a Bessemer engine from an oil field in Wagner to Wichita. He was working for Bell Gas at the time. The men told my uncle they needed his truck and that he was going to drive down through Colored Town in Tulsa and that they were going to wipe it clean. My uncle refused to be a part of it, and they held him at gunpoint and forced him to drive. When they got into town, men boarded the truck, using the Bessemer engine as cover in order to kill people as they drove through the district. My uncle Arlie said that as they were piling up Negro bodies along beside the Arkansas River in mass graves and burying them with bulldozers. As I remember, it was the east side of the river, not far from downtown. My uncle was a good man, and I know it bothered him having not tried to do something to prevent the use of his truck. But when you have a Winchester carbine pointed at your head, it is hard to refuse. He had a wife and 3 children at the time. Uncle Arlie passed away a number of years ago with wife Thelma. I sincerely hope that this oral history from my Uncle Arlie can help shed some light as to the possible burial place of hundreds of people who were slain out of hate and anger just because they were black and doing well in Tulsa. I hope and pray this helps. The second comes from a person with initials SS. Behind Rolling Oak Cemetery, formerly Booker T. Washington Cemetery, in the trees and overgrown brush is an abandoned Black and Black Creek Cemetery. The only name I could come up with is that at one time it was possibly called Lincoln Cemetery. It is on older ISGS maps, but it is not on new ones. There are various headstones, broken stones, natural stone markers, and large depressions in the ground. It looks as if the area is much larger than where the most obvious headstones are easily seen. My son and I did locate a few additional natural stone markers and a few broken headstones mixed in with the brush and trees. Has anyone thought to check in this abandoned cemetery? The cemetery could at some time have been mistaken to be part of Booker T. Washington Cemetery. Both were black only. I can show you everything I've spoken about. It's a disgrace that this abandoned cemetery is sandwiched in between 2 cemeteries, and neither of them could take care of it. It would take 10 minutes. Someone should take care of it. There are war vets buried there. So those are 2 of the stories that the Historical Context Committee has helped to collect. Part of their central work right now focuses upon archiving those stories. And so they've begun to work with the Tulsa Historical Society to archive all the oral histories that they've received now, but also to develop that into a comprehensive archive that includes the oral histories that were provided to the State Commission in 1999 through 2001, and be able to share that with the public. One of the first steps that they've taken toward that will be available on the City of Tulsa's website tonight is the listing of those reports with names redacted that were received in 1999. The Tulsa World posted a phone number for individuals to be able to call in and provide those oral histories at the start of that state commission. And so they wanted to make those oral histories available tonight. is really a first step in that. Their next immediate priorities will focus upon that meaningfully and responsibly preserving and sharing those oral histories, and outlining what that approach will look like with the Tulsa Historical Society. 2, starting some preliminary genealogical research of those victims that we already know. And then 3, continuing to collect and to preserve stories and making safe spaces to do so, like library drop boxes, the Greenwood Cultural Center, or other social media platforms. As another FYI, the community members have used both the website, cityoftulsa.org/1921graves, and others have decided or expressed a desire to call and speak with a person. Committee member Michelle Brown of the Greenwood Cultural Center established a phone line. This is also on the website, but it's 918-596-1024 for anyone to be able to call in and share their story. We've already received a few calls, transcribed those messages, and set up time to meet with some callers, but those are also going to be archived for the Tulsa Historical Society. And that's the conclusion of this report.
Thank you, Nick. Now we have a presentation of a feasibility study plan. That will be done by Dr. Carrie Stempelbeck.
Thank you. I want to start by saying thank you all for having me here tonight, and I want to thank all the members of the 2 committees, the other committees, the Physical Investigation Committee, as well as the Public Oversight Committee and the Historic Context Committee for all of your time and efforts. While I'm here in person speaking tonight, just know that I'm presenting words on behalf of the entire Physical Investigation Committee, so I'm just here as a representative. The recent geophysical survey, The recent geophysical survey completed by the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey at Oaklawn Cemetery revealed a rather large anomaly in the Sexton area. That's over on the left-hand side where the number 4 is. And that was completed by Drs. Hammerstead and Rainier and their team. The size, location, and orientation of this anomaly paired with oral history accounts lead the Physical Investigation Committee to recommend that test excavations at this location are warranted to ascertain if it represents a mass grave, perhaps associated with the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. The goals of this testing are threefold and quite limited in scope, just at this moment. First, to establish the presence or absence of human remains. Second, to determine the nature of the interments, if they are present. And 3, to obtain data to help inform the ensuing steps in the investigation, including appropriate recovery efforts if it is the determination to move forward with that in that direction. And this is critical here because it's a very complicated process. And at the moment we have the geophysical data, which you can see on the right-hand side. What the geophysical data tell us, which is very critically important, is that we have an indication that there is an anomaly. We know that there is something that has generated differences in the soil, that's generating a different signal in the soil there. And it seems very consistent with a large, intentionally excavated hole with straight sides on either side. Quite consistent with the trench, right? But what the geophysical data do not tell us is whether there are people in there. How many people would be in there? If they're buried in coffins, if they're not buried in coffins. We simply cannot glean that information from the geophysical data. So we are proposing this intermediate step to obtain just a sample and some additional information, essentially to proof of concept, if you will, to demonstrate, do we in fact have human remains here, and do they seem to be consistent with race massacre victims, if it is possible, and if they are of a condition that will allow us to assess that. We are not proposing exhumation at this time. Any human remains that are uncovered during the excavation will be treated with utmost respect. The excavations may only proceed, and this is another important point, while we are not proposing exhumation at this time, we will have to obtain appropriate legal documents permits in order to actually proceed with this testing phase. These are medical legal documentation that we would have to obtain in order for us to be able to proceed. We're confident that we would be able to do so, but it's just simply to say that that's not, we would be in a position of requesting that, but we would not be granting that. So there would be a step involved there, and I think it's something that we want to make sure we're mindful of. As part of this process, we think it's important to be reverential and respectful. Accommodations will be made to allow for safe observations of this phase of the investigation by interested members of the Public Oversight Committee. Further, accommodation will be made to honor requests for ceremonies, prayers, or similar observations that do not otherwise impede investigation. Media access would be coordinated through the city, and the city will make efforts to attempt to notify family members of individuals who are interred near the proposed excavation area. We are proposing that at this point, a relatively small area of 8 by 8 feet near the center at the base of the geophysical anomaly be exposed to determine if human remains are present. Mechanical excavation will be employed to slowly and carefully remove the uppermost top layers of soil over the targeted excavation area. Then excavation will continue by hand. All mechanical excavations will be closely monitored by 2 to 3 qualified archaeologists and/or forensic anthropologists. Hand excavations will be completed by a team of 8 to 10 professional forensic anthropologists and/or archaeologists. And the hand excavated fill will be removed from the excavation area and screened. And that screening of the fill dirt will take place on the ground surface adjacent to the excavation block. I'm providing some details here in terms of the logistics, and there will be opportunity for questions. If burials are present, we will expose those remains adequately to assess the minimum number of individuals that are in the exposed area, that excavation area, but again, not to remove, to obtain contextual clues for the burials, the extent to which people were interred in coffins or not, and also to maintain a state of preservation, because our intention here is to obtain information, but again, not to remove. And if the state of preservation allows, we're going to try and maximize the opportunity to observe as much as we possibly can and glean information that would allow us to perhaps have some other understandings of the situation. So, for example, do we have remains that seem to be consistent with race massacre victims, or is it perhaps something different, another mass grave event, such as that might have occurred with the 1919 influenza epidemic? Based on the results of the geophysical data, Based on the results of the geophysical data, we do not see clear indications of intrusive burials. And by intrusive burials, I mean burials that would have happened at a later time, not associated with the massacre, in the intermediate area between the ground surface and the potential depth of the mass graves. However, in the event that such burials are encountered, we have to be kind of anticipating that and be prepared to address that if that were to occur. If that were the case, accommodations will be made to address them appropriately and sensitively. If such burials are encountered and not associated with a violent event, I'm thinking here if this was an intentional burial, and sometimes this does happen in cemeteries, where you will have some stacking. You will have a later burial that is respectfully buried in a coffin and they just happen to be placed over somebody else. If that were the case, we would be making efforts to just simply shift our excavations and avoid, and not do anything to disrupt that individual at this point in time. In the unlikely event that removal is necessary to allow the continued excavation, such exhumed burials will be reinterred. Again, these would not be associated with the with the race massacre. They would be reinterred according to Oklahoma state laws and preferably within the Oaklawn Cemetery according to their existing practices. If the remains appear to have been associated with a different criminal event, then further investigation by law enforcement and the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner would take place as per state statutes. Again, we're expecting that's unlikely, but I feel like it's important to be honest about what might potentially happen and having to anticipate the logistical considerations thereof. It's expected that mechanical excavation could be accomplished within 1 to 2 days. Hand excavations would likely require an additional 4 to 8 days that could potentially be up to 10 days as well, depending on the nature of any discovered remains. Let me go back just a second here. Excavations will be covered by a tarp at the end of each day and security measures will be enacted. Detailed documentation will be compiled throughout the course of the excavations, and detailed total station mapping will be completed throughout and after the excavation. Upon completion of the excavations, the expectation again here is we would see this as an intermediate step. If we were to identify evidence that we seem to believe at the time is consistent with race massacre victims, we would want to leave them in a state that allows for us to come back and undertake future investigations and a recovery effort in a more thoughtful and well-planned out fashion. As such, we would be expecting to cover over those remains with geotextile fabric and wood panels or similar in order to protect those remains and then be recovered until we could return for later investigations if that were deemed the appropriate next step. And then at that point, the overburden would then be returned to that excavation block to return it to its existing state. Daily on-site meetings will be coordinated with interested members of the Public Oversight Committee. In order to brief them on the progress and findings of that day. And again, we'll have the opportunity for people to just be able to be present, to observe everything that we're doing. A summary briefing will then be compiled and distributed to the Public Oversight Committee within 2 days of the completion of the test excavations, at which point we would recommend that a meeting take place in order to further discuss the results with the Public Oversight Committee and address any questions. And also to develop a timeline for the completion of a full report of this phase of the investigations. I want to take a few moments just simply to present some examples from a comparative case study that I'm familiar with to help, I think, kind of visualize what this might look like. Eastern State Hospital was a mental institution in Lexington, Kentucky, and they had a very large 19th century burial ground that had basically been forgotten to time. And what you see here is the ownership of this property was changing hands, and it was going to be repurposed for something different. They wanted to construct some new buildings, and they were aware that there were cemeteries out here on the grounds. This is one that had been covered over largely by parking lots. Unfortunately, that was not the only kind of disgrace that they suffered. You will see there's also a utility line that came through. It's kind of challenged, it's a little difficult to see here, but there's actually 1, 2, 3 different lines, water lines and such, that also cut through this particular cemetery. This is much larger than the anomaly that we're talking about at Oaklawn, at the Sexton area. But this is just to give a visual representation. This was an excavation that was taking place completed by archaeologists at the Kentucky Archaeological Survey. We don't know the names of any of the individuals that were interred in this cemetery. There were 62 individual graves. This was a combination of individual graves and mass graves. There were 62 individual graves, 28 mass graves that contained 97 individuals, and the commingled remains of 27 individuals, so basically 186 individuals total who are represented in this burial ground. Now, these were people who actually were put to rest respectfully. And in Christian-style burials, I'll come back to this here in a second, but, and when they had individual death events, so we have indications that they were interred individually within coffins. There were wooden coffins oriented east to west in traditional Christian fashion. There are some, what you'll see, it's a little hard to see on the text here, the coffins in red represent single interments. The coffins in blue represent mass graves. These were events where many people died at one point in time, and they excavated one larger block in order to place those individuals in one go, right? There is an indication that there were multiple cholera events in the 1900s or the 1800s that many of the patients at this hospital succumbed to. And you can look down here in the lower right, this area right here. This is a closer-up image of that particular mass grave. So this is one, you'll see numbers 1 through 11 for these coffins. Number 10 at the top of the screen was actually an earlier individual burial, and this mass grave that was associated with the cholera epidemic came subsequently and was overlaid on top of that one individual. And one thing to note here, so this was, they excavated this large block, and you'll note these folks are slightly cantered. And we believe that that's because they were running out of space. They didn't dig their hole big enough, and so these individuals were off kilter just slightly, and actually you notice that they were flipped. So this individual has the head this direction and feet here, but we think that was really only just to accommodate the space that they had available for the hole that they had dug. But one reason that I bring this up as an example, is this also gives us a sense of what is possible to recover. In this case, there was actually quite a good state of preservation from the standpoint of the remains for those that had not been disturbed. Some of the burials were actually disturbed, but it was through where you had individuals who had been individually interred, and then there was a subsequent burial process that impacted those earlier burials. And that's where we had some of those commingled remains. It's not because they had not originally been placed in coffins themselves, it's just that the process of putting in those later burials was what caused the commingling. But this is a situation that, of course, is dichotomously opposed to what we're talking about in the race massacre situation, where there was not that kind of respect. And it's not that we're expecting to see the same kind of pattern. This is basically to say this is useful from the standpoint of talking about how many people you can recover in these kinds of mass grave situations. Clearly, if individuals are within coffins, that takes a larger amount of space, and that would probably mean fewer people within that block. If they are not in coffins, and if people are placed much more carelessly, unfortunately, and haphazardly, then we can expect that number would actually be larger, because you could have a hole that could hold more people just by virtue of the fact of not being contained within coffins. But this is one of the reasons that we are proposing this intermediate step of testing, is so that we know, are we looking at a situation where people were buried in coffins or were they not? Because that really affects level of effort and how many people you would have to have on your team and the resources that would be necessary to pull together in order to actually complete the much larger scale exhumation process. So it really is just about trying to get a handle on the logistics and how to better plan for that larger scale effort. I will not be showing any images of human remains, but I do have some material culture that I think is worth presenting, just to kind of talk about the kinds of things that are common in these kinds of excavations. If you do have coffins, very often, especially when they're constructed out of wood, the wood does not survive. It will degrade over time and just become part of the surrounding soil. And enriches the soil with organic content that makes it have a darker color compared to the surrounding soil. I will go back just for a second, just to say that for those who might be nervous about the machine excavation, it is actually possible for us to do that slowly, carefully, a few inches at a time, under constant supervision. And what the archaeologists and the physical anthropologists will be looking for is that kind of change in the soil that would otherwise indicate that we are encountering an area where we have a higher organic content that might be reflective of a burial, at which point we would stop immediately, right? So, but typically, especially when you're talking about coffins, because you would have a top, a bottom, and sides, what you encounter first in the process of excavation is the top of that coffin. And so you will end up seeing very often, when it's done appropriately and carefully, an outline of that coffin just from the staining of the soil. So not because you actually see the coffin itself. You will see just the staining in the soil. But when you have good conditions, it can stand out very apparently. But when you don't have that wood, what you do often have is you'll have hardware. And for simple coffins, which is very common, we end up seeing, you'll see some examples of these very, rusty nails on the left-hand side. These crosses here, these is not crosses, these are actually 2 nails. These would have been at the joins of where you have different parts of the different walls of the coffin coming together. And that's very helpful from an archaeological perspective to really help us get a sense of the shape and size of the coffin. Because when we map those out, those are going to be markers of what would have been those corners of that box. We also see examples of personal adornment. And I bring this up just basically to say, so again, we don't have the names of these individuals who were in this particular cemetery. These were people who were loved and cared for and who were given respectful burials. And in some cases, we know that they were interred with items such as on the far left, those are belt buckles. You'll see some beads next to that that were part of the necklace, were found around a woman's neck. Straight pins, also hook and eye fasteners, and the buttons. And particularly in thinking about these in terms of clothing, very often the clothing will not, similar to the coffins and the wood in the coffins, as that won't necessarily survive very well in the archaeological records. Similarly, textiles don't survive so well.
Excuse me, ma'am, and I appreciate this, but with all respect, I really am not trying to see earrings and pictures. I want to know what factual information we can gather from what we have already heard and read to what we plan to see once we start the excavation. And I was trying to wait till you wound down, but before I forget, because I am getting old, I need to know, did I read in one of the slides that is stated there will not be any excavation.
Right, so not at this point, not to say that we think that that should not happen. It's simply to say that to plan to do that appropriately, respectfully. What we feel like is important at this point is to get just a little more additional information that we do not currently have from the geophysical data to confirm that in fact we are looking at a mass grave. But also importantly, this is because this is a very large effort. If we were to take the process of initiating full-scale excavation at this point without that kind of intermediate step first, we would be pulling together a very large team to make that happen. And if we got to that point and we undertook those excavations and it turned out that what we were looking at were more likely victims of the flu as opposed to the massacre, it seems that it might be worth us taking a step back to try and get just a little more information relatively quickly in this intermediate time so we know that we're looking in the right place. Because if we're not, we need to look someplace else. We feel confident, we feel like this is, I think that there's a lot of confidence. There's a reason that we feel that it is worth the effort to focus on this now. But there are so many logistical considerations that we feel like it is warranted to just simply take this little intermediate step first to get slightly more information so that we are better prepared to address that larger effort in a more well-informed fashion.
So the survey that was done was not sufficient to warrant a full excavation right now. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and the only reason I say that is just because, like I said, with the geophysical data, it doesn't see bodies. It doesn't tell us who's down there. It doesn't tell us, are these people, and are there people there? And if they are there, are they in coffins? Are they not in coffins? It won't tell us, are these flu victims or are these massacre victims? It can't tell us that. It gives us very good data. We know this is, we feel very confident that the data are informing our understanding of the fact that we know there's a very large anomaly there with straight sides. That is very indicative of a big, intentionally dug hole. And it's in a cemetery. All things point to the fact that this is a mass grave, but it doesn't tell us about the people. And that's what we need to get some more information about. And as much as I wish it told us more, if it did, it would make a lot of things easier from the standpoint of not having to undertake those excavations first. But that's also why we're asking for patience. I know that this is not probably what people would rather be doing and talking about at this point, but we do firmly believe that it helps those next steps to know that we're in the right place first and that we can plan appropriately to do it right and to do it well.
And my final question, what do we need to go from where we are to an excavation, in your professional opinion?
Right, so this limited excavation area that we're proposing now would give us, we feel like, amongst the team, we felt like it would give us enough information to know that we are actually in the right place and that we can start to address some of these questions. That will also affect, for example, how many people will we need to have on the excavation crew, and how just all the logistics that are involved with that, because it's a much larger, that's one of the reasons I kind of wanted to point out the coffins, because that is a very different kind of mobilization of effort compared to if we're talking about commingled individuals that were not in coffins. That latter scenario is much more complicated, much more time intensive, and it's the kind of thing that we can plan better to address that more appropriately if we know that's what we're up against for that entire block rather than just the small area, if that makes sense. Also, it gives us a sense of how many individuals we can potentially expect. So give us, if we can come up with a minimum number of individuals within that smaller excavation area, that allows us to get a pretty good estimate of what we can anticipate, just using some basic math of what we can anticipate for the larger area. And those are answers that we just don't have today. Yeah.
Okay, you said your information was limited based upon said you didn't see any bodies, you couldn't see any bodies or anything like that, you just know it was a trench that was dug, okay? And that's simply based upon the type of equipment that you have.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's just based on the type of equipment. We have excellent equipment. It's just that's the limitations of geophysical data across the board. It can tell you when we have anomalies. It just can't tell you what those anomalies are.
Okay, so my second part of the question, I may be reaching really far, but we're talking about mass graves. That what you described did not happen for the most part. But when you have bodies on top of bodies and they're decomposing and you add an accelerant, so to speak, is that possible during that time?
I think that's a very good question, and I would say it is possible.
Okay, so that would interfere with your findings too, because anytime you have organic matter, it's going to be dark, and we don't know, we just don't know. So,
I think that's an extremely fair point, and to that point, that's actually something that we might be able to, in the process of this testing, we might find out if in fact that is what if there's any evidence to indicate that that was the case. Yes, that's actually, it seems to me, I would say it's possible.
So more equipment, higher tech equipment, just...
It's not going to, until we start doing ground truthing, there is no equipment that I am aware of that is going to tell us that we have confirmed 100% for fact that we have human remains and what the nature of those remains are and who those individuals are.
Okay.
I wish that were the case.
Thank you for those questions. We're going to let you go ahead and finish your presentation, and then we're definitely going to take more questions from our committee at that time.
And I am almost done. I'm sorry. I appreciate your time. So one thing I did also want to raise with this particular slide and talking about the possibility of encountering personal endowments. Let's see here. I see Phoebe. Hi, Phoebe. She's on my screen, but I can't seem to advance the slide. Okay, I can probably just summarize this. Just basically to say, I know this may be a needle in the haystack, but one thing we would like to ask of the Public Oversight Committee is that thank you. It's something that may not be as consequential for this initial intermediate step, but for future, like if there is a larger scale excavation, one thing that might be helpful is, do you have knowledge, stories that have been passed down in your family, photographs, any indication of the attire that your loved one might have been wearing on that horrible, fateful day? And so this might be in the form of typical attire. Did they wear suspenders? Did they have a particular type of jewelry? Would they not leave the house without their pearls or what have you? Did they have a belt with a distinctive buckle? Did your great-grandmother wear hair combs? Did they have a pocket knife? Would your great-grandfather have had a particular pocket knife that he never would have left without? These are things that I hope I'm not overstepping here, but I think it's something that the Historic Context Committee, I think, would be very well suited to trying to help collect that information. That's information that it is, again, a potential needle in the haystack. But with the example that I presented earlier in terms of talking about Eastern State Hospital, we don't know those individuals' names, but in some cases we recovered personal adornment that might have been recognizable to someone had there been an opportunity to go back to the 1800s or ask them for that. But it's basically to say, there might be something, and maybe you don't know what it is today, and maybe you want to think on it, but I'm putting it out there to say that this is something that may actually prove to be useful. If and when we're at a point where we can actually recover information like this. And then I'm going to wrap up by then just coming back to the other recommendation of the Physical Investigation Committee is to complete some additional geophysical survey in the Clyde Eddy area, which is at number, down here where that 1 is. So you'll see the red block there is where they did the survey previously. We're looking at wanting to shift that to slightly north. The intention here is to try to relocate the geophysical survey area that was completed about 20 years ago to see if we can actually find that and try and replicate those findings. They had another anomaly. They had an anomaly that they identified there. We would like to, we didn't see that in the round of investigations that we completed this last time, but we're hoping that if we simply adjust slightly, we might be able to intersect with that previous survey block and hopefully try and locate yet another location that may be a point of interest. Any other questions?
We talked about good conditions or optimal conditions for excavating or for testing. Is that something that is going to be weighted on for better conditions, or can that be done even in nature?
Actually, it's going to be to the committee to make the determination of whether they want us to move forward with that effort. And then we're talking about scheduling that isn't necessarily about the conditions that I was referencing in the presentation, had more to do with the actual physical conditions of the remains themselves, which can be in different states of preservation, depending on the context and the conditions. So that was kind of more what I was talking about there. As far as the conditions go, it may be, as far as when the excavations would actually happen, it may be more a matter of when we can get the schedules to coordinate appropriately amongst the physical investigation team to actually make it happen, and in coordination with the city and making sure that we have all the logistical issues worked out.
I mean, not a question, but a comment. Just the section 6, right there, the street. You see,
Yeah.
and for future purposes, can we refer to that as the Darren Cravens area?
That's the Darren Cravens area?
Yes, because he was the individual that first mentioned that when he tried to give the information to the media, but no one listened to him. He's actually here tonight, he and his family, and so I think that as we call that area on the bottom, Clyde Eddy, I think section 6 should be referred to as the Darren Cravens area.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're doing questions right now from the Public Oversight Committee members. For members of the public that I see raising your hands, if you picked up a comment card when you came in, if you can write your questions down on that, we'll come around and gather those and then ask that at the end of the meeting after we talk about a couple of other issues as well. So if you have comment cards, please write those down. If not, I'm happy to come bring those to you for the couple of hands that I saw raised.
Couple of things. With your material, with your equipment, were you able to pick up the nails if there was actually coffins and coffins attached together by nails? Will your equipment be able to pick up the nails at that point in time?
And I'm going to preface this that I am not Scott Hammersmith, so I'm not the geophysical expert, but at least one of the pieces of equipment is actually capable of picking up metal, right? But what I can say is that there was not an indication from the geophysical results, as I understand them to be, that indicated that would have looked like coffins. That doesn't, and so, but I would say that if there's probably a much more technical response there that I'm not in a position to provide, but but to my knowledge, and also what he incorporated in the interpretations in the report were that there were not indicators, geophysical indicators anyway, of specific coffins. Doesn't mean that they weren't present, just that it was not something that was otherwise showing up in the data.
And also, on our first meeting that was held on 36th Street, the event center, there was one of our Tulsans, Miss Pruitt, she might be here today. How you doing, young lady? How you doing? Now, from her testimony that she, based on what her mother saw for herself, being buried from her front porch, which that's on Peoria. Is that correct, Ms. Pruitt? They was on Peoria? Yes. And so we are looking at the area that's along 11th Street, and of course around the 240 whatever freeway system that is right there. So her home, if I'm correct, Ms. Pruitt, was along Pure, I guess it's a warehouse there now.
Yeah.
Right. And so from her front porch, she was able to see them being buried. So so I was wondering, when you go back out there to rescan the larger area, that would it make it possible to also scan the area that Ms. Pruitt has suggested what her mother had witnessed in 21?
Okay, let me just ask so that I understand. So you're talking about the area that is number 5?
No, this would be along the gated
okay.
fence. It's not shown on.
It's not shown on this. Okay.
Yeah, it's
okay.
a long Peoria.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not a native.
It's okay.
And so I have to orient myself. We would, we're still taking in any information with regard to other potential locations of interest, and so definitely I think that's something, if you want to make that suggestion, the team would be looking at that.
Thank you, Ms. Pruitt.
Thank you, Ms. Pruitt.
That was it for me. Anybody else?
Doctor, I have a question. You mentioned earlier that you need to get permits that are needed to do the research you need to do. I'm confused slightly, so forgive my ignorance on this subject matter. Why would you need to get permits if this is being treated like a crime scene?
This is actually completely consistent with, so like the ME's office would have to, they have to get these permits, and I'm actually, Angela, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's the ME's office, am I saying this correctly, that if you are doing an exhumation, you have to go before a judge in order to get authorization to do so, correct?
Even for a crime scene? Okay.
I'm deferring to our legal folks on that front to provide us with the proper guidance on what we need there to make sure that we're in accordance with the law. So.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Is Ms. Phoebe ready?
I think. Okay.
Okay, while we're doing that, we have another question.
The question that I had, that you talked about the Clyde area, you want to go a little further north, is that what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm just wondering why that wasn't done when folks were out there and they were getting these results like within 2 days or so. While they had the equipment and they were out there, why they didn't go further north at that point?
I'm going to admit that this was a kind of belated aha moment. We were under the assumption that we were looking at the maps in a particular fashion. What we think is actually when they were printed in the report is that the orientation was flipped. And when we flip it and look at it in that new kind of orientation, it makes sense based on what we see in the cemetery now. It was just simply something that we didn't recognize at the time of, and that was basically looking at the results of that earlier investigation. And I don't know if that was an issue, an editorial miss on the part of the original publication of that document. We don't know for a fact, but it just simply was the case that honestly, we didn't actually realize that until December. It was after the last meeting. Was when that aha moment kind of hit, and that's why we adjusted the plan to incorporate this now, because we do think it's worth going back out to take a look at that. Mm-hmm.
Also, you mentioned that some 20 years ago that particular location, you said that cross-section had not been identified in terms of where they looked some 20 years ago. Are you saying that spot also was not scanned?
Well, so this is the thing, is we thought we were actually trying to intersect with that area from what had been covered 20 years ago. But we saw no indications in the data that were similar to what they found 20 years ago. And then it was upon closer scrutiny of looking at these maps more closely to try and understand what might be going on there. That's, again, when it was like, what if we look at it this way? And just simply looking at it in that new orientation led us to believe that we were actually we may not have actually been looking in the right place. And so we just need to shift that up, and hopefully, again, we're trying to intersect with that so that we can try and relocate it.
The last question is, there had been, in the original report, it talked about basically the coffins that were already buried, right? So we're not looking in that area. We already know they were laid out and identified, those coffins. We're not looking there, right? That's my question.
Not at this point. Are you talking about down there, number 3, like in the corner down there? Right. Not at this moment. And that's not to say we're not taking anything off the table. It's just to focus on the mass graves for the moment.
Yeah, no, I don't think we need to find anything that's already been found.
I'm familiar with mechanical stripping at archaeological sites and how individuals can do that very carefully and accomplish what they're trying to do for archaeological excavations. Using mechanical stripping in a cemetery and over, if this is a mass grave, I would have concerns about bringing in a track hoe and the weight of that machine and taking it all the way across and back and forth if there are human remains below the surface. And that's a concern, I would think.
And I can certainly understand that. Were you done with?
Well, I have that concern, and also just for areas in general and the layout you have of the investigations, there was no specific references to how you're identifying the human remains in terms of the fact that you've still got your tribal members here with concerns of the identification of our tribes. And there was no mention of the tribes in this.
And so what I would actually say, and that's not an intentional, that was not intentional, it was not an intentional oversight on our part. Basically, this is kind of a fact-finding effort, and if there is anything that you would like us to take into consideration as we're looking at those, that you believe would otherwise be an indicator of potential Native American affiliation that you would have as a point of concern, we will be happy to receive that information, much like you're on the Public Oversight Committee along with the other members of the Public Oversight Committee. I made that specific reference to personal adornment, but if there's any other elements, features, things that you want to ensure that we are being mindful of in our efforts, please feel free to convey that.
And if you could take into consideration the track hoe and look at the potential depth. I know in the information that was provided, it appears that those anomalies are rather close to the surface.
And that's the challenging thing. And I've actually had a lot of conversations with Dr. Hammerstead about that. And unfortunately, we don't have the kind of information that actually says the depth at which we would expect to encounter the mass graves if they are present. This is why we would be proceeding cautiously, extremely cautiously, and with the expectation that it could happen sooner than we would earlier at an earlier depth. And in point of fact, it's the kind of thing that we would probably cease the mechanical excavations at an earlier depth, even without confirmation, and resume with hand excavations at that point. But it's just simply the realities of actually trying to accomplish this in a fashion that can be done. I mean, I think you've managed to shovel many times yourself, and you know how much work that would entail if we did the entire thing by hand, and how much time and labor that would take. And that's the only, and we would not recommend this if we did not feel that it could be done well and carefully and cautiously.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned that public oversight committee could be present during the excavations. Would we all be able to allow tribal members that are qualified to be present that are not on the committee, like a tribal archaeologist?
I think that's not a question that we have entertained at this point. We were focusing on the Public Oversight Committee. I think that's going to be a question that we would want to, if you want to make that as a recommendation, I would say if you want to put that forward, and then that would be one of the things that we can address. I don't feel like I can answer that today. But,
And also, you mentioned a team of experts that are qualified archaeologists and forensic individuals that we'd like to recommend that you present the CVs or resumes of those individuals for the Public Oversight Committee to review.
okay. Thank you for that suggestion, Raylan. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you for those questions. So we'll move on with Phoebe now, if she's ready.
Hold on for 1 second to just switch over so we can all see your face. That work? You're on officially.
Okay, I can't see you, but good evening and thank you for your patience with my long distance presentation. I wanted to be available to address some questions that you all had. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay, the view, I have a frozen view of me. So,
I'm sorry, Phoebe, that's a terrible view for you.
comments I wanted to make, I want to reiterate our need for the test excavation because I've been involved in a few excavations that have yielded human remains, and even when preservation is good, if we're not careful, if we don't have a careful excavation, and by that I mean if we don't start with a good test sample, we won't know until we put a lot of effort in what the context of the remains are. I mean, what event caused those individuals to be buried in that location if we find remains. I am hoping that preservation will be good for the cemetery area, meaning that bone, actual, easily recognizable human bone will be obtained, but the other reason for the test excavation is to see if the preservation will allow that. I personally will be looking for features of burned bone that's been interred. I tend, in those circumstances, the charred areas aren't always as well preserved, but other color changes can be preserved, such as going from bone color to whitening and then to charring, but it depends on the preservation. And if the individuals were buried in coffins, there might be features that are consistent with having been burned. If there's not burning, I'll still be looking for signs of multiple individuals having a violent, having met a violent death, meaning gunshot wounds, and or other signs of blunt force trauma. And those clues for a test sample, if the preservation is poor, we may have to examine all remains we get in the test sample just to conclude that we have multiple individuals, and we may or may not realize the context. But finding personal artifacts, clothing or remnants of clothing buried with deceased, that can be helpful, or at least give us a time context, hopefully. It'll be ish, because we're still dealing with people that are all occurring around the same interval. So, with people born and dying before the 1920s, but by the 1920s, but preservation is the key issue here, and it'll let us know how many forensic anthropologists we'll need going forward. So I'm prepared to bring 3 or 4 additional experienced forensic anthropology trainees. So some of them are master's degrees, so they already have a degree in forensic anthropology. Others are in training and thoroughly experienced with human skeletal anatomy. And with those individuals and myself, the test phase, we all recognize human bone and trauma very well. And have an answer, did we get the right location in a cost-effective way? And so, because we still have other sites to investigate, and this will be our first real ground truth moment of do we have the individual, some of the individuals we're looking for. So that's the first stage. So I envision going from a test pit phase. I'm hopeful that these are our individuals, and then that will be full-scale excavation of the feature, and that will require other economic plans. So I've researched what we should expect for costs of further chemical analysis, if we're finding remains for individuals, and if we need to go on to something so far future as DNA analysis, near future as things like I'm imagining microscopy that might tell us more about age, and using more intensive, still destructive techniques for determining ages of individuals. This all depends on the preservation of the bone there, how intensive we have to do an analysis. And once we're beyond laying out skeletal material, once we're beyond that phase and looking at it, chemical or genetic or testing, destructive testing, then we're looking at different goals. How clearly we want to identify these people versus just recognizing that these are the ones. These are the ones with trauma indicative of this event. And I do recommend having an examination phase and end it before any destructive analysis. Make sure we cover all of our known features, meaning Oaklawn, all of its sites, the Canes area, and any other areas like the Rolling Oak / Liberty Cemetery. Make sure we examine all of our known sites before we consider anything that's destructive or remains that we have to cover. Because those just involve other, destructive testing involves other concerns that needs to have a public discussion. And that's I don't want that discussion to impede the recovery of the remains that document this is what happened to our relatives. And so that's the kind of process that I am planning for, our activity during and after the test pit. So if you have any questions that I could address right now about the skeletal process.
Well, one question I had is, how soon are we starting this intermediary process? I was at Oaklawn this weekend and I saw a section already fenced off. Is that the section we're talking about? And if so, how soon are we looking at beginning?
Well, this is partly a question for the city, but the Physical Evidence Committee, we discussed a few days. Many of us would prefer to have an April excavation date, this coming April. Partly because of the weather, we'd like to keep it cooler and have as thorough time to concentrate on the remains as possible. If funding does not allow us to use an April start date, then July, then the fiscal year turns over, and I can tolerate that. I don't want to kill any of my colleagues. July will still work for me. So we could do that, but we are trying to have, this test phase occur as rapidly as possible so we can roll into the next phase, the more intensive excavation, if the results turn out as we hope.
I'm sorry. I'm from Alabama and I just moved to Oklahoma not too long ago, but it still is pretty hot here in April. And if we can kind of push it up closer to like February or March, what all roadblocks are in the way? Maybe I should ask the city, what all roadblocks are in the way from us? Because the area is already fenced off. We've already had a survey. What is, and it's a city-owned cemetery. So what is in the way of you going out there next week saying we're going to do this intermediary step, which is, since it's already smaller in scope, what's in the way of doing that?
For me personally, I can't come back before the middle of, this is February, so before the end of March. I personally can't come back to Tulsa before then. When we were comparing our calendars, many of the colleagues found that, we all have other jobs too, our colleagues, we all have other jobs. So, our flexibility extends to, many of us are able, which is very good, but not all of us are available in March. And so that is part of the funding is rather limited. There might be funding available, but I'll let the mayor speak to that. But our initial goals of funds has been spent on maintaining security out there overall.
So Phoebe, this is Amy, I'll jump in. There are a couple of things. First of all, before we proceed, we would seek consensus from the Public Oversight Committee that this is how you want to proceed. So that's really the first step. If we feel like we're in a place where we want to go ahead and give that blessing tonight, great. If you need more time, we understand. So that's the first piece. The second piece is we've spent most of the already allocated funding, and so we would be seeking to work with the City Council on sort of a mid-year budget transfer to cover this additional work. We're still working with the Physical Investigation Committee on that budget. So that's the second piece. The third piece is, as was mentioned previously with Angela, we would need to do an exhumation order. We actually think that will be pretty straightforward. We're not really concerned about that from a would we get it, would we not get it. We just need to go through the process of seeking the exhumation order and having that granted. And then the third thing Phoebe already spoke about, it's just getting the people who will do the work to Tulsa. So they have families and other jobs, and we do want to make sure that we're accommodating, giving them enough time to plan to come and be here. And then I'll add, one of the important things that was mentioned in Carrie's presentation was having members of the Public Oversight Committee who could come and observe and be present. And so we also want to schedule that with you all, the observation and the documentation.
Yes, I wanted to ask, I noticed you talked about, and you talked about exhumation and what that might entail, but also you talked about recovery. So if you could just, in layman's terms, I guess, if you're excavating, right, and we're talking about intermediary steps, is it possible you excavate, you say you see bones, and then what do you do? Because if you're not going to recover them, and you're not going to exhume them, what would you do on site?
So it depends on how, so the cemeteries can be complex environments as far as bones. Let's say we start digging and it's with the excavator. Say it's just a small excavator perhaps, just like a bucket can be like that. Like we're excavating with that and we see bone not in the ground, but in the backfill pile. And so we stop, identify the bone in the backfill pile, and if it's human bone, then we go back and carefully extract that out of the pile, and then go and look into the excavation itself, that hole, and see if there's any bone left in there, their related elements. And if there are, then the most expedient step would be to stop digging there in this small bucket scenario and move to one other part of our 8x8 and dig there instead, because if that particular burial, they're unknown, right? So we're not expecting a burial there. But if there's features that go with that exposure, like there's fabric you can identify, if not a coffin, there's things that are telling us it's a fairly recent burial or not. Maybe you're running into just remnants of bone and no indicator of why it should be there. If we're getting other clues, we can go, oh, this is just no more burial, we need to move over. But if we keep getting remains at a shallow depth, then a shallow report what elements are there, what skeletal, what skeletal remains are there, and we'll see if we can even move them. And if we can move them, we need to really have a reason to. By reason that we kept getting the rest of the test pit and hit the bones of interest at a normal burial depth. And it seemed a little isolated, a one-off. I'd rather work around that so we don't have the predicament of now we have to put this unknown person somewhere, but they were already here, and why disturb them when they're already here? And I'm hoping we won't get any of those. It does happen. It can. And so that the idea of being let's not intrude on her that we don't have to. So anyone that's if we keep digging, say that no one chooses one, we get to 6 feet, we're seeing human remains at the depth we're used to seeing, then we do the same process and we clear everything off. We get to, let's say we use the excavator and we're not getting any bone. And so we get to about 5, let's say 4 feet. And we say, okay, we know we've done 4 feet. We're going to go to trowels and shovels from here. So we dig down to the next foot. We still don't get any remains. But then that next foot, if they're in before then, let's say they weren't often. So that next foot, we start getting crushed cranial remains, or maybe crushed pelvic remains, or maybe not crushed if that area hasn't had a lot of traffic. And you don't want to. Once we start seeing human remains, especially the ones with higher relief, then we go to delicate, troweling close around, try and leave. The goal is to leave the bone. So this is soil. You want to leave the bone pedestal on soil so that we can see what's underneath it. Because in a case like this, especially with mass burial, what we don't want to find out after the fact is that we took this skeleton off and this skeleton was underneath it. And this taking off the top one might just damage the one underneath or leave parts of the top one tangled into the one underneath. So we always dig around with everything carefully, each individual bone, like all the individual hand bones together, all these arms, we just make it very detailed, very careful penciling of the remains so we can document that this is one person, and go on to the next person if they're not touching. And if they are touching, we just keep penciling around the larger mass until we have basically this overview of all the remains. So, but we do have constraints there. So, let's say space isn't the problem, we just keep clearing sidewall, clearing the burial out so we have space to be in there, showing that there's a skeleton here and that there's a next skeleton. So that's not a constraint. The bone quality preservation could be a constraint, meaning that, and I'm just more hopeful, but I have seen ancient bone, where it was fine when you first took the soil off of it. You could see that there was bone, you could identify it, you could say, hey, it's a hand bone. And then by the time you got everything around it clear, it dried up a little bit and then crumbled. And it looked like bone dust after that. So, will that happen there? I don't know. Oklahoma, different environment, but we hope to find out, right? So if the bone quality is poor, we have some options, but from a forensic standpoint, I usually don't use bone preservatives. I usually try to just hurry up and get the remains documented, photographed as they were found, and then extracted as rapidly as possible. But because there's a long time span involved here, the century going by, I'm hoping preservation will allow us not to need to resort to something like bone preservatives. So bone preservatives are chemical preservatives. They're like a varnish, they're like a glue, and they're not glue, but they are plastic solvent compounds that you soak the paper remains with. The fossils that dinosaur hunters use them all the time to harden the bone in place. But the catch with using them is you use up your chemical testing chance. If we were going to do, say, an isotope test to identify where there's well and if the bone is that bad, we have hope that any successful DNA extraction. But you do also run the risk in my past use of bone markers. I've had to be very careful not to harden dirt onto the bone. That's just one of the risks of using bone marker in that kind of estimation. But that's a worst case scenario. I've not used bone marker in the context, only in the archaeological. And that was really a fossil context. So, but that's the overview of what happens. Then after the remains are pedestal, we say where they lay up where we can see what's underneath them. Once we've photographed them thoroughly and taken any measurements that we need to take there, we remove the remains and lay them either, in like a tray in a cardboard box or even in a paper bag, something that befits how well preserved they are. So a lot of remains have to be kept cushioned, so it can foil, if there's very crumbly, we can foil the whole remains. I've used a substance that's like floral foam to make cushions for remains that were very crumbly, so it just depends on the state of preservation, but we remove them and then get them to a secure location where they need to dry some more, they can keep drying, then any further studies can go on. By further studies, I mean if I need to take measurements, or if the bone is very intact enough to take measurements, it might tell me something like, well, hey, say I shot a skull, or parts of the skull, and I wanted to see if that person had particular ancestry. So this part of your skull is interested in it reflects your ancestry. The same way you just look at it and go, okay, or not okay. But the way that you look at a person and see their ancestry, I mean the race, because that's a whole quality. I mean that I have African ancestry. That's featured here behind my skin. And so I would have to measure that, or sometimes it's visible without measuring. But let's say the preservation is so good and stolen from pieces, so I have to reconstruct it, so glue it back together, and then measure it. So
Can I cut in quickly, Phoebe? I'm sorry. We have a question from one of our public oversight committee members.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Kenny. We have a question from one of our public oversight committee members I wanted to get to with you.
Mine is to Amy, considering everything that you stated tonight. I don't know what type of parliamentary procedure we need, but to give you our full credit and faith to go ahead with the intermediate process. With that being said, how feasible is it to be done in late March or whenever Dr. Phoebe can make it back in?
So the Physical Investigation Committee has been discussing dates leading up to tonight, and I think we feel strongly that if you give your blessing this evening, we can commit to doing the work as proposed over an 8 to 10 day period in the month of April. And we would confirm that date with you following this meeting if you vote to have us move forward.
To piggyback off of that, it was mentioned that that the area be secured. Is that by just police officers, or will there be video surveillance of the area?
So we do have a 24/7 security plan in place for the site already. It is under 24/7 video surveillance, and then we would also have a human surveillance anytime there's an opening. We feel it's really important to have a person present anytime the ground is open. So that's the other piece we've talked about.
Any other questions on this portion?
Okay, thank you. We'll now move forward with an update on the geophysical survey or scanning of the Rolling Oaks Cemetery given by Ms. Amy.
I don't know if we're going to have Phoebe for the balance of the meeting, but I just want to thank both of you for your work on this and helping those of us who don't have the level of technical understanding that you do kind of put it in terms that at least I feel like I better understand it. So thank you both very much.
So we promised that we would provide you with an update on the geophysical survey work to be performed at the former Booker T. Washington Cemetery, currently Rolling Oaks Memorial Gardens. For folks who are not familiar with that site, the State Commission received reports from cemetery workers and a witness account from a man named Elwood Lett, who was told as a child not to walk on certain parts of that cemetery. Geophysical work was performed by the State Commission at Rolling Oaks / Booker T, but that work was inconclusive. And so we've been seeking to revisit that site with new technology to confirm whether or not there are anomalies present in that location. So we have been in conversations, the City of Tulsa was in conversations with the private property owner, and he had been seeking some guaranteeing of the work to be performed because there are human remains interred in the area to be studied. State law prohibits the City of Tulsa from guaranteeing work of third parties, and so we've been working with the University of Oklahoma. We were informed late last week that the private property owner is signing an agreement with the University of Oklahoma that will allow that work to proceed. And then the City of Tulsa is meeting with that private property owner Thursday morning. So we're going to be discussing any other open issues and scheduling for that geophysical survey work, probably also along with the Clyde Eddy site survey work that Carrie showed you up on the screen. So following Thursday morning, we will have an update for you. We'll probably update the Public Oversight Committee via email, and then we can post an update for the public on our website following that meeting. And I think that's the update. And if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take those.
Are there any other questions? Okay.
So the agreement between OU and cemetery, has that been signed?
So I was on an email with the private property owner's attorney where he said my client will sign this. I don't know if it has been officially inked to paper yet, but we're proceeding as if executed, and in that we're meeting to discuss scheduling on Thursday. So, and we can probably get a copy of that agreement from OU also. We can send that out to the Oversight Committee.
And if this agreement, is it in part, one, would it be public so we can all see the agreement? And two, are they, the graveyard owner, are they only allowing a certain part of the suspected area to be searched, or the committee can search the whole general area known as the Abraham Lincoln?
So it's not a blank check, so to speak. It is for specific areas, and there are some requirements about the dates being coordinated with the property owner. But I think that's really because they also have funerals and other events in the cemetery. It's an active cemetery, and so it's to ensure that this work can happen unimpeded. They'll actually close the cemetery down when the work is happening, but then also out of respect for people who have loved ones buried or who may be attending funerals there.
That area is a forgotten area, so I don't think that's a problem where it's a situation where it will impede future burials. It's a forgotten area, so it's just an issue of having access to get up in that area.
Just so we're really clear on the area, we have an electronic copy of the state geophysical work that was performed at Booker T. Washington. I'll ask Nick to share that with the Public Oversight Committee. And in the area to be scanned, there actually are some, they call them cremains, where people have been cremated and then there are urns buried. They're close to the surface. We don't think they would interfere with anything from the race massacre, but there are some human remains in the area.
see her earlier. So just so I'm clear, you all have already done a study at Booker T, now known as Rolling Oaks. Why were we not notified that that had even taken place? Because if we are the oversight committee, then what is our purpose if we're not being privy to what studies were done when we've all are available for that?
The only study that's been done was done by the State Commission back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So that is the State Commission report that's on the city website. And so we haven't in this round with new technology.
I apologize, I thought you meant you all had already went this week.
I'm excited that you have a tentative agreement in place. I'm still nonetheless disappointed that from the very beginning, when we made a 3060 been in place, till today, there is still not a solid understanding in place. I'm excited for the potential, but we have been living off potential for decades, and hope for decades that something will be done. So I cannot stress to you how important the first signed document that you all get on Thursday, that you let us know, because this should not be that difficult to get. I do know bureaucracy has its procedures and processes, but we're almost at, we're over the halfway mark with this committee, and we have yet to be able to have access to that cemetery, and that is very, very problematic for me.
And part of my number of questions, I've been dealing with this particular cemetery for too long, and I know too much. I am very, very, very sensitive to the point where a certain area will be dictated where it will be searched, and it's enough area to be seen. The stories I've heard over the years, that the area just, and I think the same place that Scott Ellsworth had identified on the south side of what was known as Haiti Creek, that separates the Rolling Oaks and the forgotten Abraham Lincoln site. And so I've been told over the years that in the fall, when the leaves are down, when its foliage is not down, you can easily and see some of the tombstones that's on the north side, on the south side of the creek. It's the opposite side of the Rolling Oaks. When I talked to Clyde Snow decades ago, no, not decades ago, but many years ago, when he stated there, he did talk about the urns and stuff like that, but there was a number of burial furniture that was removed, disturbed, and disordered. It's even got worse over the years. And so I'm thinking that it's a situation of bait and switch. I saw a lot of destruction of known markers that was in place for years, and I got pictures of that from that time. And recently, when I went out there, I saw that whole area destroyed. It really hurt me at the fact that nothing was done at that point in time. So it's a trust issue with me. And I think we as a committee should not, again, not have this to be dictated where you just take this little corner and we'll allow you to be right here. Especially in the point when they had stated already, you can see some of the tombstones in the fall. Not so much the tombstones of the right dead, but just tombstones that were just north, just south of the Haiti Creek. And so during that development of the village of Ashley Creek, all that was wiped away during that time when I was out there. So I'm very, very cautious. I'm very curious on what limitations that are out there. I understand the urns.
This gentleman's been wanting that, and why is it on the committee that gets to make the comment?
No, we're gonna have questions and comments for the general public at the end. We wanted to get through these presentations with the physical investor, or with the public oversight committee initially. And she'll be here for that too. So our physical investigation committee is staying throughout the entirety of the meeting. Phoebe, are we lucky enough to keep you for a few minutes, or do you need to go?
Was that to me?
Yes. Yeah. We have a few members of the public that want to ask some questions of you specifically, so I wanted to make sure we weren't intruding on your time. We're going to lose you in the near future.
I'll be here. It's just that you have to get closer to the microphone, the questions, because I can't always hear.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'll be here.
Okay. Thank you, Phoebe. Are there any other questions right now in terms of those comment cards from the public? I picked yours up. Yep. Okay, and we can get that person in touch with our physical investigation committee. Happy to do that.
Okay.
We have one more question over here, please.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Just dealing with, I guess, location, you see there's going to be an agreement between OU and private owner.
Because OU is actually the overarching entity that's doing the work, so yes.
Okay. And I was also thinking, okay, think about, they had done this years prior, right? And there was no such agreement because there were different players involved. So I'm thinking there's another way to go about this. But if we're going down this path, my question is, will we be privy to what the parameters are going to be that's going to be decided between the private owner and OU? I think that's my question. And if that's the case, when would that be? Because as it's been stated, we don't really get any information. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of our getting a better understanding of what this private owner is suggesting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as soon as we have that agreement, it will be an open record. The University of Oklahoma is a public entity, just like the city of Tulsa. We're going to share a copy of that signed agreement with the Public Oversight Committee.
So that's my difficulty. I'm not interested really in seeing it after it's signed. I'd like to see what the details are going to be prior to an agreement.
I'd be happy to share the draft with you this evening.
Well, no, I mean with the entire committee is what I'm saying.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. It's a little interesting. We have a copy of the agreement, but the city's not a party to the agreement. So it's being negotiated directly between the property owner and the university that we have.
So, okay, all right. It just sounds a little troubling because it seems like the main folks that are at the table making these agreements aren't the folks that really would be most interested in terms of what our concerns are as it relates to descendants, as it relates to that site, and because it's been so problematic,
We would be willing to entertain a change to state law that would allow the city to engage in this, but this has been incredibly frustrating, I think, for the Public Oversight Committee, for city staff. I have some coworkers here who know, like, no one has lost more sleep over this than I have. And we have to, we have to move this forward. So at the same time that we've been encouraging OU and the private property owner to proceed under a contract and agreement between those parties, we've also been doing the due diligence to prepare a search order. So we also have that lined up as our backup plan. I mean, we're really trying to address this from every angle. But we'll provide that draft agreement this evening. If there's feedback, we'll make sure it gets to the right people. And then we'll keep moving ahead on preparing a search order, because if the private party private property owner and OU can't get this done, we're still going to proceed under that search order process.
And could we pop, just an idea, if OU and could there be other folks, because I know other people have volunteered at no charge who are experts to participate in this process. And I'm just saying, I don't want us to close ourselves off to other folks that are capable. And we could have been getting along further and faster, but.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. That's actually the next item on our agenda, so I'm gonna hand it over to Nick. But if there are other entities who'd be interested in working at that particular location, they would still need permission from the private property owner. But I'll hand this over to Nick to address that.
Thank you, Amy. I do want to state just how frustrating and how difficult this process has been. There are clear state legislative hurdles that do prevent us from being able to directly enter an agreement with that private property owner for OU doing that work. So we'd love to talk to you about how to remove some of those state legislative barriers, Representative.
If we can remove OU from the process, then that's all I'm saying. There are other folks that could participate. I know where we are now, and I'm here to talk about legislation that needs to be done, but again, this was done 20 years ago, and it was done in a different way.
And with a different property owner as well, I believe, at that point, right? And so we're in a different circumstance with that.
Still privately owned, and.
Correct.
And so the dynamics are the same, all I'm saying is we're gonna move forward from where we are, but let's not act like we need an act of Congress to do what we gotta do.
We don't, it's not the state legislature, actually.
I'm not gonna go back and forth, okay.
Okay. So let me talk to you about your question about how we can invite other parties to this research. So we've had someone that has approached a couple members of the Public Oversight Committee, as well as the city, about wanting to be involved in this work. With OSU, actually, had a professor and his graduate student that was hoping to do some of this work here. And part of what we talked about with a few members of the Public Oversight Committee and discussed internally is what is a process for either OSU or for anybody else that wants to do this work, either on the city sites that we're viewing as our primary locations or other locations where there's oral history that identifies that that is a likely site or a possible site for race massacre burials. What is a process for this Public Oversight Committee and for the city to be able to evaluate those? And so we've discussed that in really a couple of different approaches, but really coming at it from a couple of core values. One, I think, Christy, you said this specifically about this effort should leave no stone unturned. And so we have an incredible team of experts that have been assembled, but there are others that can come in and offer different perspectives. How are we evaluating that? And how are we thinking about making sure that we're bringing all the evidence that we can to this process? The second piece, though, is also wanting to make sure that that's done with expertise and with integrity. And so how are we speaking to anybody that's interested in doing this kind of work and evaluating publicly their expertise, their experience working with spaces specifically like this, and then with remains that would fit this context, and how do we ensure that those groups are also operating with the same level of transparency that we've asked the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey to do as well. And so what we've discussed initially is having really 2 tracks in place, and we want to bring details of these 2 tracks back to the Public Oversight Committee in the future. One, we're hoping to meet with OSU in the next month when the professor returns from Africa to learn more about their process and their technology, and have them prepare some kind of proposal that outlines what that technology is, where that experience is, and some of our requirements from a transparency perspective, and have them present that information to us so that that can be evaluated by the Physical Investigation Committee and also by the Public Oversight Committee, and really come to this group at the final stage of that process of, does this meet the level of expertise and experience that this committee would hope for, and is the reporting that would happen to this committee in line with what we've asked from the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, so we're ensuring that that level of reporting publicly is there as well. We would ask probably for that path to be followed for those 3 primary sites we're looking at right now, so if work is happening simultaneously with work that we're doing, that is included in the city's process and that's brought back to the Public Oversight Committee. The second track is if you have a group that's interested in doing work outside of those 3 primary locations. So Crown Hill Cemetery as an example, or other locations that maybe oral histories point to, but that aren't one of these 3 primary sites. And for that, we discussed that being something that could be, to your point, represented in agreement directly between that private property owner and that company. That if that's something that they would like to undertake, that's something that could exist there, and that could be information that gets included into this process or helps inform a next phase in this process, but wouldn't necessarily need to be vetted by this group or by the city as part of this larger work to make sure it dovetails with everything else that we're doing. So those are the two tracks that we've discussed. Generally, we would want to bring back some of those details of this committee to make sure we're thinking about that kind of value piece of the expertise and the experience appropriately. That transparency and that reporting back to this committee is there at the level that you'd expect, that you've insisted upon really in the work that's been done to this point. But that we have that path for people to be included both in our primary sites and in secondary sites, if that's something that that those experts are lined up for and that property owner would permit. So I'm happy to answer a couple of questions on that right now, but I know we'll discuss that in more detail as well.
Thank you for that, because as you know, I have been in conversations with you before about Dr. Jaswal with Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, and he did approach you all about wanting to be a part of the process, and I really want to convey on his behalf that he wants to work collaboratively with the other teams, but that he does bring state-of-the-art equipment, and not to say that someone else's equipment is not good, but just more equipment to have more tests done. And then they also have a probe that goes into the ground where they can tell if there's mass grave and how old that is. And so those are the things that we need to use. We need to use everything that's available. And as I said, no stone unturned. But my question is, if they go through this vetting process, and this is Oklahoma State University, when you have mass graves or things like this that we're going through, most universities are involved in that process. But if they go through this vetting process, what's going to be different this time than the first time that they came to you all?
So speak maybe the origin story of some of that, and I'll tag team in Amy if I screw anything up. When OSU first approached us, it was the graduate students specifically that approached us and wanted to do that as part of the senior thesis. And so as we were thinking about who would be a part of the team that we were compiling for the Physical Investigation Committee, there were a couple of things that were really critical to that. One is clear expertise dealing with forensic remains like this. And two was that it would treat this site and these sites like the crime scene that they are. And so those are really two of our key criteria, and both of those pointed pretty quickly to the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey for a couple of reasons. One, as you've seen with both members here, as well as team members like Phoebe Stubblefield, there's some clear expertise and a lot of experience doing work just like this. And two, the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey is who the State Medical Examiner's Office partners with for their work, who, if this is something that kind of rises to that level of criminal activity, and the medical examiner's office has jurisdiction in that space, the Archaeological Survey is who they would partner with. And so for those two reasons, those became clear reasons for us that was the right group to compile for that Physical Investigation Committee. And so we began that work down that path with them. I think to your point, as they came back, as the professor I think was more engaged, and it was more of an institutional support level, which my understanding at least is where OSU is asking about right now, that shifts it from a student approaching it from a thesis perspective to an institution that's seeking to bring their expertise and their experience to this. And so that's why we want to do that similar evaluation that we did with the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, but have that path for them to be involved. Yeah.
So this committee has the power to say we want OSU, Dr. Jaswal's team, to be a part of this process.
We view it, as we talked about it so far, good Lord, as a joint process. So it would be reviewed by both the Physical Investigation Committee and then brought to this committee. Yeah. No, we would bring their recommendation to this group. Yep. Whether it's in favor of or against. Reverend, do you have a question?
First question that I have is in regard to a continuation of what Representative Goodwin asked and what Amy answered as far as the Old Booker T Cemetery about this procedure where we have to go through a third party. Is that a new law that just recently passed? The states, we have to do that, Amy?
So no, it's not a new law. However, previously we just obtained consent. And honestly, and Angela could probably speak to this better than I could, but I think most times when this happens, people generally just agree and give verbal consent. And so this has been a much longer, more laborious process that a private property owner is entitled to under the law. But man, it sure would have been a lot easier if he'd just given verbal consent like last time. And so we've been trying to navigate this on the 2 tracks that we mentioned because we didn't get verbal consent, basically.
So, and that was always the conundrum at each meeting. We're close, we're getting an agreement. Then last meeting, we have a document we send over, we wait on his attorneys to sign it. And now tonight, we're waiting on some people to sign some more documents. It's almost like I used to teach school, and Greg and Christy work at GLA. If every time there is a due date for a paper, and every single time there's a due date, the child says, well, I have it for you next week. And then next week comes, and the child says, I have it for you next week. Then next week comes, then the child says, I have it for you next week. There comes a point with the teacher where the teacher has to grade the student on what they have not turned in. And that is why, in large part, the North Tulsa Greenwood community has given this city an F in terms of looking out for the best interests of folk in Greenwood. So that's aside. My next question is, and I hope that there's a better answer for this than the last. Where are we with the evidence that was turned in 1973 to the Tulsa Police Department that was verified, turned in? I've asked about this at previous meetings. I've mentioned it at the police chief hearing that we had right here in this building. I stood right there. I want to know tonight, where is that evidence? From anybody that has an answer.
So first of all, I would say if the city of Tulsa were the student or the teacher in this process, it would be really great. But unfortunately, we're like the tutor who's trying to advocate for a student who doesn't even want to be in the class. And so, I mean, I hate coming back to you and not having a path forward on this. I know that there's nothing we could do that would make this process less productive than give you another reason not to trust your city government. And so that's why from different time zones, different countries, we have been hammering this private property owner because, believe it or not, we want to find the truth too, and the only way we can get closer to the truth is to look with this new technology. And I'm not saying you have to trust us or that you should trust us, but at the end of the day, we want the same thing. And so I will keep you updated. I will keep doing whatever I can. And if you have ideas for something else, let's get together and let's do it. Yeah. Yeah, but we'll talk. The other question. Yeah. So for the photos that we have heard existed from an eyewitness account, the eyewitness never said that they were entered into an official case file, and so I don't know what that is. No, yeah. Never entered into an official case file, but we have asked staff at the academy and police headquarters to look for those photos. No one has found anything yet, but also those two locations are not in the same buildings that they once were. And so we're hoping that they're not lost to history, but personally, I mean, below the chief, within the department, we've had conversations with individuals that I know you don't have to trust them, but who I genuinely trust to look hard and do the right thing, who are looking for those photos. But they haven't found them yet. And there have been people on the physical investigation committee who have had follow-up conversations with that eyewitness. I think that witness account, it's not perfect. A lot of time has passed, but we're still trying to do our best to find them. We haven't yet.
Amy, I've got one more. Nick, just to your point, you all, as we talk about the problems that we've had at Booker T, I've asked from the very beginning about Crown Hill. We talk about owners that said, come on out, we've been waiting on you all to come. And we're talking about people that wanted to cooperate. We're talking about credible folks, past massacre survivors, who talk about that oral history. And I'm just wondering, why did the city now say to me, basically, well, maybe if you want to have a third party go out and look at that, perhaps that could be handled that way. I'm wondering, why did we ask the public to come out and tell stories and give their oral histories if we were not going to do anything new beyond what had been done 20 years ago in terms of the 3 areas we were thinking about searching? And I do know, came up with the Canes area, and appreciate that. But I never ever, in all of these meetings, do I get an answer as to why we keep bypassing that area, those eyewitnesses, those oral histories. And you got owners right now today that welcome you, that want to say, let's get to the bottom of it.
I think to speak to that specifically, we've always talked about these 3 sites as being the primary ones, but not the only ones. And so because of, as we look at the extensive costs and the timeframes and the teams that will be required as we look at excavation and possible exhumation of these primary sites, especially in Oklahoma right now as we go into that with the testing phase, we know that that's going to require an immense amount of resources. And so we want to be able to channel those resources toward those 3 primary sites that were identified in the 2001 State Commission report and focus on those. Part of the reasons we're asking for this oral history, we want to chronologue all of that and archive that at the Tulsa Historical Society, is our goal is not to stop at those primary locations, but to then be able to channel those same resources toward those secondary locations once we've investigated fully those primary locations. And so it's not we're not going to Crown Hill. That is a secondary location that we hope to get to after we've been able to complete the investigation at these primary sites. And so part of that is collecting that information now so we can be clear on what that information is and we don't lose the institutional memory and the oral histories that are there. And so we want to collect everything we can right now on that. We know that there might be time between now and we're able to get to those secondary sites. And so part of this is also thinking about if individuals or organizations want to do that work outside of this and in a way that doesn't cost the city or doesn't pull resources away from those primary locations, we'd love to have them do that on their own. And then that information can be folded into, in a lot of ways, in the same way in which those studies back in 2001 is informing our work now, those studies can inform future work there as well.
Are we down to 1 out of the 3 original sites that we're looking at? 1 right now, that's what we're looking at. The new block was kind of ruled out.
It was.
And then Booker T is problematic. So I don't think the expenses that had been anticipated were fully utilized if we were looking at originally 3 spots. So again, that's it.
No, that's a very fair comment. I think, so we haven't done the excavation work at the Canes yet, so we're still waiting to see the full extent of that and what those costs look like, and we haven't been able to get into Booker T, to your point. And so I think what that scanning looks like will really inform what those times and those costs look like, and then this intermediary step of doing that feasibility testing will help us determine what the full team and what the costs look like for all of that. We've always kind of talked about doing this in phases, and so phase 1 with geophysical work will be complete once we're able to go to the Rolling Oaks and Booker T. Washington Cemetery, but that really helps just inform what costs we can look at for an excavation phase for phase 2. And so our goal is to be able to have that full scope of all 3 phases and be able to plan and dedicate all of our resources to those, and then be able to look at those secondary sites. And if there is capacity to do more there, we will, but right now we don't have enough information to know that. So.
Okay, in the interest of time, we want to thank the Oversight Committee for all the questions and engagement this evening. We want to now move on to our public questions. We'll take a few of those. Do you have those cards?
I do, yeah. So one of the questions from Ms. Jones asked, do you have a start date for when the mechanical digs may be? We talked about that a little bit. We are hoping to do this in April. If we reach consensus and sign off approval from this public oversight committee tonight. Yeah, I actually want to get to the public questions in case there are other questions that come from the public that inform your perspective before we get to that officially. But hope to get to that tonight. The second question is from Barbara Fields. I'd like to know if DNA analysis will be conducted to found individuals. Dr.
And Phoebe mentioned this as well, but basically we're at the point right now compiling information to get a better sense of what that would entail. And we just have a number of unknowns right now, but we are actually pulling that information together and exploring that. It's not a very solid answer. It's in process, so we're pulling it together. But there's just a lot of things depend on that, and some of that is going to be, hopefully we'll get some answers from that testing phase to know what we actually have at this phase. But again, this is where we've had a number of people looking into what would be involved with that, what would be necessary actually to complete that, and then we'll probably be coming back for a further discussion down the road. Do you want to add anything to that, Phoebe?
Only that, I mean, we are looking at the cost of DNA analysis, but it does want a public discussion because there's a whole issue of information, how we attach it to living people, you able to know, even making questions. So it wants a public discussion, aside from just the cost.
So the next question from Lucy 1 asked that we contact the medical school to see if bodies were delivered around the time of the massacre. That's something that has come up occasionally in some of our oral history about some of these bodies potentially being used for medical science. And so I think our historical context committee continue to look into those oral histories specifically around that. The second question is, are there more sites? And so we talked about that a little bit with Representative Goodwin's question. What about the old Booker T Cemetery, which Amy addressed? But there are a number of other sites, and I think I point you to the oral histories that were collected and archived back in 2001 that actually mention a number of sites, and that was really the drive. Those oral reports were gathered in 1999, and that really drove a lot of the analysis of the State Commission that identified these primary locations. But there are certainly a number of other locations that have been talked about and have that kind of oral history behind them. And those are the ones we've identified as that second phase. I think the third kind of additional feedback is bodies were dropped off of the bridge and then disappeared the next day. And so that speaks to a lot of the oral history we've heard about bodies being dumped in the river, doubting if any were buried at the Kings, but there were others shipped in railroad cars in ice, which is the oral history we've heard about the medical school specifically. Next question was from an anonymous person. Has there been any stories reported about the Sexton's College being set on fire at the time of the mass burial at Oaklawn? As all records were destroyed and all funeral homes had to assist with naming citizens in Oaklawn not readily identified. I haven't heard that from my perspective. Is that from you as well?
That's from me.
Okay. I'd love to be able to get more information on that and be able to, yeah.
There were some different rumors that we had heard. I looked at different things. There was a fire that was in the Oaklawn area, and it was about the same time we did the transition from the convention center to the baseball field. It was observed about that time that there was a fire at Oaklawn, but we haven't been able to confirm it.
We have a number of historians that are on our historical context committee specifically that are doing some of that investigations into those oral histories. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to put you in contact with that committee specifically so they can do that historical analysis and research there. So if you and I can circle back after this, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Next question from Mr. Frederick Bell Sr. If a person has been buried for 100 years or more, what would their clothing look like? You mentioned that question really being driven by actually finding remains in your backyard that were a couple hundred years old. Phoebe, can you speak to what that might look like?
Go ahead, sir. The reason I'm saying this is because I lived here on north of Denver, and guess what happened in 1980? I'm not familiar what year, but as I was tied up my yard, I came across a trench coat. I didn't know what it was. I just cut it and threw it to the side until my German Shepherd, Max, started digging and digging and digging. And Lord and behold, the more we dug, the more we found. It found out what an arm had come out to be the coat and then an arm. And then it turned out to be not an arm. And I found out the dog wouldn't let the bone go. Was from a right or left arm, I can't quite remember. We took the dog to the vet because he started foaming at the mouth. I went back and dug up, it was a skull. The skull, someone had hit the person in the back of the head with the backward inside and crushed it in. I had then called Tulsa police and it got nasty. They were trying to indicate that I had murdered somebody and they tried to blame everything on me. And this what's going on here. Other people don't know about Tulsa. We got the good and the bad and the ugly. I fought this, and they archaeologists, they came out there, cold my yard and everything, and then they wanted to run my house. They didn't want to show who the ID was, they just showed it and dropped it and kept on going. But what happened was, we dug up the skull, we got the whole coat up, it was fully intact, a leather coat. And also the boots, the remains, the split, and everything was in the boot, ribs, arms, stuff that was messing with my dog didn't eat. Now the Tulsa police took all of this. Forensics come out there, they wouldn't give me jack. So I'm going to tell all of y'all, you got to be careful how you handle your business. I can't say how Tulsa, how they was in the 1980s, but people can hide things right in front of your face and you don't know it. They blindfold me because I was asking for evidence. I had glass in my yard dated about 200 years. I had no idea until I went to and bought a personal book from Syracuse Museum. And I found out who the guy's body was, who was missing. This whole north side area was nothing but cattle. I'm finding cattle bones in my front yard. But anyway, forensics came out, they got the body, they got everything. And then I started collecting with the Tulsa police. It was a nasty situation. No evidence. They won't give you the information, but they will accuse you of something. So when you start dealing with a lot of bodies, a lot of evidence, you can turn around instead of being someone trying to help somebody and turn around and get hurt. And that was just beginning. I had put on a carpet at my tree, which was finally cut down. And for the people here came in my backyard, they took the slice of tree that I had, and they looked at the race ride over 8 years. They had the smoke on it. Tulsa has it right now. If you want to, you can get it. I don't know. They even got it. No one showed me no information, who I need to contact or anything. This was just 3 days of fighting the smoke living in Tulsa for a long time. You got the information, but they're not going to give it to you because they wouldn't give it to me.
Can you speak to the remains question, Dr. Stubblefield?
Yeah, I heard parts of it, but I understand that you said you have a backyard burial that you told the police about and they tried to indicate you and added it to your yard, and then eventually forensics came and got it. But your question is about how well preserved clothing should be if it's been 100 years.
It was 200 years old. It was over 200 years old.
Okay, so you got have, hair, beard, still observed, color of hair, even though the person's buried, you can be well observed. So you can have everything like that, and so, and for 200 years, still look fine, that's perfectly reasonable. Or we could have oral preservation. So I'm hoping for the excellent, because I'm assuming, never expecting that if these are riot victims that will be excavated, they may have already been, some will be burned probably, I'm hoping they won't have been burned because that affects the preservation of clothing. We want personal artifacts. That's our hope of reuniting these individuals with their identities. But that preservation is not unreasonable what you experience. I'm sorry you have to work around on some of these stuff.
Thank you.
We have two pieces left. One says, I get an anonymous person said that last year there was a white man on TV who said he was a child in 1921. He was with his parents and saw the box that they were building in, and they threw bodies in, not in caskets. And the top was on that large box. And so I saw that on TV, and so wanted to contact that story on TV and that man to see if we could reach out to him. That's actually consistent with a lot of the oral histories we've received about Oaklawn specifically, and that led us to look for some of those mass graves in that location. So that's very consistent with a lot of the stories and oral histories that have been provided there.
If I'm recalling correctly, that's the Clyde Eddy site that we're proposing doing the extended survey work in.
Thanks, Amy. And final question for Mr. Gilliard. Why are you requiring written questions? All previous meetings allowed verbal questions. It looks like you're trying to muzzle the public. So, fair question. Let me give some background to that. So we began really trying to collect oral histories at those first couple of meetings and set open microphones to really collect that information. And after that, we were able to form the Historical Context Committee to better collect those, and so we used some of these comment cards to be able to collect and record that information, and then be able to hand that information to our Historical Context Committee. So it helps us from a record-keeping perspective to make sure we can get in touch with the right individuals and have those experts do that analysis. It was also something that our Public Oversight Committee requested to make sure we can capture that information more effectively. So we did have open mic meetings for the first couple. We found it really difficult to track that information and make sure we could do that follow-up appropriately, and so we shifted to question cards because of that. Are there any other questions and question cards that I missed? Yeah, Christy.
I know some people will probably disagree with me, but I know what it's like on the other side of that microphone. So I would really like it if we did open up those for comments to people to speak on the microphone, because I know that the comment cards, it makes people feel like they're censored. But if they do have stories, then we should still be able to have something where they can write those to keep for record. And then also, I believe they can do that online as well. But for people who may just have comments or questions, I think we should open that up because it does help with transparency. And I have been getting a lot of questions about that. So I would like for the community to be able to come and ask questions and make comments with the microphone instead of the cards.
I really want to, I want to really focus on this being looked upon as a crime scene and not a negotiation. Because I feel like we're negotiating with terrorists. Like we got to make some kind of trade agreement with some owner of a place where our ancestors actually are buried in the ground. And I think that search order should have taken precedence over this agreement between OU and this owner. It's just something that just doesn't taste right, because we're saying this is a crime scene. And we're going to treat it like a crime scene. And it makes more sense to me to actually have a search order in place to go do the work we are destined to do. The other thing regarding the missing graves, and I hope that gets addressed about the search order and why it doesn't take precedence. Has anybody spoken to Robert Caddy, that former police officer? Okay, so was it the historical committee or did you all, the city, talk to him?
Actually, Dr. Ellsworth spoke with him directly. He's our chair of the Physical Investigation Committee.
Okay, considering Pastor Turner has asked for these photos and we want a thorough investigation of what happened to those photos, it makes sense to me that we have that person brought in for questioning. Really do a thorough investigation to find out who he talked to, who else knew about those photos, so that we can ask all the parties in, that are still living while they still live. We can get those people and say, hey, do you recall what could have happened to those photos? Who was in charge of the transfer of documentation when it went to a new department? When you moved documentation from one place to another, who was in charge? So that we can verify, get some kind of testimony or testament about what could have happened to those photos, because that's critical evidence, right? To a scene that we're actually now talking about, we're talking about the Canes now. So I think we need to do our due diligence to make sure that we really treat this like an investigation and not a negotiation, right? I think that just makes sense.
Amy spoke to this a little bit. Part of the reason that we were hoping that we'd reached an agreement with the private property owners is that would be much faster than going through a court order. And so we continue to try and go that path so we can get to these results more quickly. As Amy mentioned, though, as that became more and more difficult, we began looking at that to be able to execute a warrant, to be able to do that search and do that investigation. So we're running those essentially on parallel tracks right now. So Amy spoke to that a little bit, but when it became clear that that reaching an agreement wasn't going to be a quick and easy thing, and we hit roadblock after roadblock, we began going down both paths to make sure we had that option available. We're still hopeful that this agreement that Amy has seen in this meeting Thursday morning gives us that clear path to be able to do this, but if not, that other option is still on the table. But it does take
It's not a good trade-off for us knowing what's in that contract and being able to say, we agree with
completely agree.
that owner and OU has agreed to right now. We're clueless. We don't have any idea what that arrangement, what that agreement looks like. We don't know what the language recently says. We're going to close, we're going to shut down the cemetery. Does that mean nobody can come in, oversight committee can't come in? We don't have any understanding of the language in that contract.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that's shared tonight.
Conflict, and that's not a good trade-off for time.
Yeah.
Right, we've already waited for years. Kevin Ross's been on this for decades. Mayor after mayor, investigating team after investigating team has done nothing when we had permission. Now we're negotiating for permission. And that's not a good place for us to be in right now. And I think we may be underserving ourselves by allowing somebody else to take our opportunity hostage because we want to do this efficient or in a more efficient manner, a more timely manner. That's not a good trade-off.
I would also say it doesn't have to be like the quicker and more efficient way shouldn't sacrifice quality there. And so, as Amy mentioned, we'll share that draft language with you tonight. If there are real concerns there, please surface those to us so we can make sure that those are addressed. But that's not to say that we're looking for a smaller study area or for results to be rushed in that. It is that it wouldn't require the laborious and lengthy legal process to get that warrant. And so because of that, it allows us to move with the kind of urgency we're trying to move with everything else.
I just wanted to underscore that there's a little bit of calculated risk here. So if we go and we seek a search order, we don't have perfect evidence. Typically, when you seek that search order, you have to have particular evidence. You have to know where you're looking, what you're looking for, and what you expect to find. And we generally have that, but the shortcoming is the people who saw this evidence, who were involved, are not with us anymore, so we're hearing it through a game of telephone. It's hearsay evidence. So that makes it a little bit risky to seek a search order. The second thing that makes it a little bit risky is there's been geophysical survey work done in this location before, and it was inconclusive. So a judge could potentially say, you already had your bite at the apple, you don't get to do this again. And so there's a little bit of risk that if we seek a search order, it could be a judicial no, and then we totally burn that bridge with a private property owner. So we could close two doors with one shot. And so I know this isn't perfect. Like it's kind of like you're it doesn't work the way you want to one way, it doesn't work the way you want to the other way, but there is a little bit of risk calculation here. Like we're just committed to, we're going to keep pushing forward because we have to find out, we have to look.
I just wanted to know if our new committee chair will be allowed to be in the room on Thursday when that meeting is happening. Because I know you're planning on sharing the draft tonight, but if there could be a representative
Yes.
in the room.
Yes, I will.
Is there any documentation? Well, first of all, Dr. Phoebe, is there, what is the best conditions of finding the remains of DNA being present and being able to be analyzed? That's one question. Number two, the second question is from a state level and from a city level. We do know that there were bodies during construction time in various places around the city that came up. What is the process of finding out those remains that were found? We do know when they made the Creek Turnpike, they kept on coming across bodies near the Booker T. Washington area. Is there any kind of follow-up or documentation, like when they made the construction roads? I heard people talk about, or the Tisdale, when it was being dug up, that bodies were being dug up at that time. What is the process? Does it exist? And if so, what was done to the remains on that? So I got those two questions for the scientists, the city, and the state.
As far as the DNA question, if the best test would be teeth, if we give gloves their teeth, they retain nuclear and mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that talks about you, and the DNA that talks about your line, those would be the best sources. And after that, you tag, especially the femur, the thick bone, the eyeball. If we get it tagged eyeballs and are willing to take them apart, then those will be the next best source potentially. But teeth are really the preference for this time scale.
And thank you. And on the second question, as far as on the state level, those remains found on construction sites, i.e. the Creek Turnpike and other areas?
Okay, what I can't answer is what, I have no specific knowledge of those, what was found on those particular cases. What I can say is that we do have state burial protection laws that do call for a process. So if human remains are encountered and discovered, state burial law does dictate that they have to immediately stop any kind of work in that area and immediately contact law enforcement. Their next step is to then contact the ME's office and to evaluate that location in terms of its potential for forensic interest. So, but unfortunately, I don't have specific knowledge to be able to say what did or did not occur in the Creek Turnpike situation that you were referencing.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank everyone for attending this evening. And that will conclude our meeting for this evening. Our next meeting will be Monday, March 2nd at 5:30 p.m. Here at the Rudisill Library. Thank you so very much.